Welcome everybody to the ABOTA Fort Lauderdale Cybersecurity Forum. Thank you guys all for joining. My name is Brent Reitman. I'm the current president of ABOTA's Fort Lauderdale chapter. We're very excited for the presenters that we have today. It's a topic that could not be more timely. If anyone saw the cover of the most recent Economist, that was the cover story, was Broad Bandits. And after the recent Colonial Pipeline attack, it was the first time that I'd ever seen an American president publicly discussing the threat of cyber terrorism for the American people. I'm sure that everyone has experienced, whether through anecdotal evidence or personally, someone who has fallen victim to a cyber attack. And so we're overjoyed that we have our panel of experts here to discuss those issues with us. I want to first introduce our panelists that we're extremely lucky to have. We're going to be having three speakers today. First of which is Bruce Spector, who's joining us from Baltimore. He's the chairman and founder of Baltimore Cyber Range. He has worked with the Department of Defense. He's been the CEO of Matrix Engineering, which focused on U.S. intelligence community applications. Before that, he was the vice president of special projects for Wiltron Company, where he worked with the U.S. intelligence community. Before that, he was a staff engineer for HP, who oversaw sales to, well, stop me if you've heard this one, but the U.S. intelligence community. He's a Johns Hopkins graduate along with Judge Levinson. So we're happy to have Bruce here today. We also have Brian Butterfield, who many of you may know him. He is the managing director of Microtech, IT and cybersecurity services in Fort Lauderdale. For the past 25 years, he has been providing IT and security services in the South Florida legal community. Many of you may use him. He does a fantastic job. And I'm also told that he has a new book coming out called The Game Has Changed, which focuses on small business security and IT advice. So I urge everyone to check that out. We also have Robert Reynolds joining us from Morris & Reynolds Insurance. It's one of the largest and oldest independent insurance agencies out there. He's actually the third generation of Reynolds running the business. He's a certified insurance counselor. He's a certified professional insurance agent. He's an accredited advisor in insurance. He has been named Agent of the Year by the Society of Certified Professional Insurance Agents. He is here today to speak about some of the insurance implications of cybersecurity and what policies are available to help protect law firms and small business owners as well. So very much looking forward to hearing from this panel. I think I'll start this off by directing a question to Mr. Spector. For all of us out there that aren't so familiar with some of these cyber threats and cybersecurity issues, what's out there for us to be worried about?
So, I mean, that's always an interesting question. The cyber threats have been around for a while now. This is not 2 or 3 years old. I mean, since the advent of operating systems and software that controls your computers, there have been bad actors that have looked to exploit those systems and find ways to take advantage. There are just, I don't want to scare people, but there are databases about the kinds of threats that exist. There's a database that people in the audience can look up. It's called Metasploit. There's something over 10,000 known cybersecurity threats that exist. And what's particularly striking about that is those are all easily protected. The problem is that most people don't protect themselves against those threats. As an example, upgrading your operating system takes about 75 to 80% of those known threats out of the equation, but they're there. And if you don't do those types of things, you then have those threats to deal with. So as the operating systems get smarter, the criminals get smarter and the threats get smarter. So the threats that you're seeing probably in the law practice are threats that are not what we call 0 day. 0 day is a term we use for stuff that no one's ever seen yet. They're typically done by nation states or by very well-financed criminal organizations. So the things that the lawyers that probably are seeing are things that are in the Metasploit database that we know about, and they can be protected. But if you don't go through that process, then you're going to be vulnerable.
And Brian, I know that you deal with a lot of law firms and how they're handling these issues. What do you see in terms of, specifically with the legal community, what sort of threats we're being faced with?
Well, I mean, I see this on a daily basis, and it's all too common. One of the most common attacks are phishing attacks, and everybody knows about them, but that still accounts for 86% of the ransomware attacks that we're having today. And, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there are all kinds of things that you can do to help protect yourself. And the number one risk in any law firm or any small business for that matter is always going to be the human element. You know, we can train and train and train again, but it's always the human element, the person that clicks on that link or that goes to the site they shouldn't go to, that ends up causing a chain reaction that can be absolutely devastating. You know, there are several examples of major law firms that have had huge exposures, not only financial exposures, but reputational damage. I mean, that's something you can't put a price tag on, is if your client's data gets exposed, or you're a victim of double extortion, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, where someone has your data and they're threatening to extort you unless you pay the ransom, or they're going to publish your client's files. I mean, it's just, it is the Wild West out there for sure. And as Bruce said, there are certain things that we can do to protect ourselves. Now, I will say this, if you have an IT professional or a cybersecurity professional that says that they can make you 100% unhackable, it's time to get a new IT professional or cybersecurity professional, because that's just
Amen to that.
absolutely not the case. Any system can be breached. I mean, the NSA, the government, spends millions and millions of dollars on cybersecurity, and they get breached. You know, we are, you know, us, small businesses, law firms, are the low-hanging fruit. And, you know, there's so much we can do to protect ourselves. And I think this discussion is really important, because I think there may be a lot of things that many people don't know that they should be doing, and we're certainly going to get into that.
So why is it that we're seeing, it seems like, more and more of these in the news? I think, you know, I mentioned the Colonial pipeline attacks. There's been several, I guess, high profile. Why are these things becoming more prevalent now?
Well, what I would say is, you know, this is the great double-edged sword of our connected world. You know, we have a vast amount of information at our fingertips. I mean, if you don't know the answer to something, you Google it. I mean, back in the day, if you didn't know something, you got an encyclopedia, or you went to the library, or you asked a smart person what the answer to the question was. But now we have that information immediately. I've heard of some law firms during voir dire actually looking up information in real time on a potential juror. So you can find out a lot of information about somebody in a few seconds. But I think that accessibility comes at a cost. And one of those costs is security. So data security is an exploding issue, because the amount of digital data that we're all generating is increasing exponentially. And the dark web has a booming economy. Not to get into the weeds, but real quick, I have some numbers which, you know, not need to alarm anyone, but a study done at the University of Maryland, Bruce, in your neck of the woods, stated that an internet-connected computer is attacked every 39 seconds in the US, and 45% of Americans have their personal information compromised by a data breach in the last 5 years. I mean, those are staggering statistics. And not to belabor the point, but just one quick story. I was at an IT conference last month in Orlando when things just first started getting back in person. And one of the speakers was Kevin O'Leary of Shark Tank fame. And I know he was speaking to an IT audience, so he may have embellished a little bit, but he said the first thing that he worries about when he gets up in the morning with his businesses is, are they secure? Are they being hacked? Are they a victim of ransomware? And his point was that every business owner should be thinking that same thing every day.
So I certainly wouldn't take issue with Brian saying. I couldn't agree more. And you know, when you increase the number of nodes in your network, the more access people are going to have. But one of the qualitative concepts about the criminality of cybersecurity is that they can. It's like the John Dillinger, why do you rob a bank? Because that's where the money's at. And we haven't taken the reward aspect out of cybersecurity. We have not done that. We can, and we're moving towards that because it's rising to the level now where we have a president that's concerned about it. We have an administration that's concerned about cybersecurity. And what we're seeing is policy issues that need to be addressed to stop this. Now, everybody in this room that uses a computer, whether they like it or not, has a security profile. You may not know what it is, you may not understand it, but until you do, and until you do something about your security profile, you are going to be held victim to those problems. And to echo what Brian was saying, it's the Wild West out there. It is. And unfortunately, the targets are the low-hanging fruit. And I think I told this to Mitch the other day. It's like the Russian proverb. If there's two Russians and there's a bear chasing them, the one Russian says to the other, you know, I don't think I can outrun that bear. And he says, well, you don't have to outrun that bear. You have to outrun me. And that's very true. In other words, the low-hanging fruit are the targets that they're going to go after. Colonial Pipeline wasn't targeted because it was a strategic infrastructure facility. It was targeted because their credentials were on the dark web and they were available and they were live. That is inexcusable. Those kinds of things should never happen. And that's all about how you treat your security profile. So I mean, that's just, I think that's kind of, I was trying to echo what Brian was saying about the reason threats are as prevalent as they are today.
And to just sort of zero in on something that you guys were talking about, you know, dealing with how the human element is sometimes the issue here, and how the Colonial Pipeline got infiltrated. It seems as though you're really only as strong as your weakest link. Is that how some of these issues work sometimes?
Well, in cybersecurity, you know, we have to get it right every time. The bad guys only have to get it right one time. And you're right, you know, it does just take one link, but the whole concept of a holistic approach to cybersecurity is that you need to have many layers. And, you know, we're going to, I'm sure, address these layers during this conversation, but, you know, you have to have a robust security profile. You have to manage your risk. And I think, you know, not a lot, most people that are on this call, they have an IT provider, maybe someone that they've been with for 10, 15, 20 years. I know I've had clients that long, but the question that I always ask is, have they engaged you in a conversation about cybersecurity? Because, you know, if IT companies today, with everything that's going on, if they're not leading the cybersecurity, they absolutely should be. And if your IT, you know, I would take the initiative. You know, cybersecurity is a two-way street. I mean, your security provider or your IT provider has a responsibility, but you have a responsibility as well. You need to be able to work together and have a discussion about what you're doing to protect yourself. We have like at least quarterly, we call them TBR, technology business reviews, with our clients, where we don't only discuss technology and what's new in technology, but we talk about what are the latest threats, you know, and what are we doing to protect ourselves? What are the latest technology the cybersecurity things that we can do to make them safer. So I think that's a conversation that every principal, every business owner in a firm should be having with their IT professional.
So, and it's deeper than that, and I agree with what Brian's saying, but cybersecurity is an esoteric, is an esoteric subset of IT. And everyone in this room has some IT capability because they have a computer, and companies like Brian, managed services are crucial to making sure that your operations flow well. The problem is that security changes so quickly, and it's so difficult to deal with the security that management within those firms needs to think about not just the technology aspect, but the entire aspect, the human aspect, the data flow aspect, all the different things associated with data in a digital world. And you need more than just good technology. You need policy. And your law firm needs a policy, your team needs a policy. And that is something that currently is lacking. And that is why we're seeing this uptake in threats.
So I would agree 100%, not to cut in, but you know, I don't, a lot of times I don't see law firms with acceptable use policies. I very rarely see law firms when I go in with a cybersecurity incident response plan. And Bruce, I'm sure you're probably going to talk about that a little bit later, but you know, I mean, the time to have.
Honestly, it's not. I hear you, and it's not that the law firms don't have them. They're not. They don't understand the threat yet, because the threat is relatively new. It's becoming, the threats are becoming exponential. They're seeing them, and
Right.
it's becoming high profile. So the firms are going to get there. It just takes time, and that's like the Wild West. You know, you didn't have, what was it? You didn't have law west of the Mississippi. You didn't have God west of Denver in the Wild West. Well, we're going to get there. It's just going to take some time, and that's why these kinds of seminars are so valuable, because the people that are running their firms, not the IT departments and not the security departments, but the lawyers that run these firms, need to understand what they're facing. They need, in some cases, they may not be that terrible, but in some of these big firms, you know, you guys got, I'm sure you have intellectual properties, and you have personal data on health, and you have trademarks, and I mean, things that are very, very valuable. In many cases, it's very similar to U.S. government classified data. You know, your privileged data needs to be protected much more than somebody that runs a marketing firm or an advertising firm, you know, or a restaurant. You've got data that could, if it gets out there, could hurt people, or could damage others, and that stuff needs to be protected. And you guys need to start thinking about who's looking at that, who's going after that. And I don't think you are currently. I think you need to get there.
So how do we do it? The most important part.
We can. There's many ways to do it, but what you need to do is understand your data profile, understand what you got, understand who might want your information, understand how your information is protected now, understand how your employees are. Are your employees trained? Do your employees understand the problems Brian mentioned earlier? Does your managed service company understand the technologies and the threats that are out there? Does he understand 0-day threats, non-0-day threats? Have you had someone come in and look at your system and say, look, these are my gaps? The cybersecurity people, you call it gap analysis. But have you looked at your entire operation? Is your architecture set up properly? Do you have the Wi-Fi behind the firewall? Is it in front of the firewall? These are the kinds of things that a managing partner probably doesn't know how to do, but somebody does. And you need to go in there and have that looked at. It's like a burglar alarm system. You know, you probably don't know how to put an alarm system in, but there are people that know how to do that. And those are the kinds of things you need to think about.
And Brent, good afternoon to you. I have to say, I agree with what both Bruce and Brian are saying. Your constituents have a treasure trove of information that is very, very valuable, as I think Bruce mentioned. And I think what the overriding theme here has to be is risk management. We know that the risk is growing, as you just heard, exponentially by the day in ways that we can't even imagine. And what we also know is that most of us on this seminar today are of a certain age that this probably isn't the first risk we think of because we didn't grow up with it. And the younger ones, you know, they understand it maybe potentially a little bit better, but we have to shift our minds to realizing that this is a very, very dire and expensive threat to all of us on this call. And so to manage that risk is going to require us to kind of change our thinking and focus on it. And I agree, it's certainly doable. All of us spend a lot of time thinking about risks like our malpractice risk in our performance. And we think about here in our community, you know, the risk of something like hurricanes for the last 30 years. Before that, we never did, but Hurricane Andrew changed all of that. And we spend a lot of time in most of our days thinking about those types of things or making sure they're insured or mitigated. We need to do the same thing here, and it's achievable. It's just that we need to focus our thinking on managing these, you know, new world type risks. They're not going to get any smaller. They're going to continue to grow. So we need to turn our attention to it, as is happening here today with this session.
And to support that, to support the concept, you know, insurance is a very important tool in your improving your security profile. It's a mitigation technique. However, more and more you're going to find, and I'm sure the insurance guys will tell you, is that these companies are going to require you to increase the robustness of your profile to begin with. You're going to have your employees trained. You're going to have managed services that have pen testing. You're going to require all kinds of functions, things that you've probably not thought of, that people have thought of before the insurance companies decided to offer the policy. As an example, the US government now, within the next 4 years, has mandated that every US defense contractor, and there's over 300,000 organizations, must be audited and meet a security assessment before they will be allowed to receive a purchase order from the US government. And these audits and assessments are going to be very expensive. They're going to be $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 an organization. But the US government deems that that's important because they cannot allow classified information, or cannot allow defense information, which is proprietary to the US government, to be violated. And, you know, think about that. Would you want a bad guy to have access to a nuclear weapon, or a bad guy to have access to public safety? So these kinds of things are very, very serious. Law firms can get a jump on this. You know, you can look at what other firms are that have been hit and what they've done, how they protected themselves. But again, it goes back to this idea that you have got to look at your security profile and understand how to treat it.
I agree. And, you know, I think that more and more law firms are getting the message that their data is worth something, because for the longest time, I would have conversations with existing clients, prospective clients, be they large firms, solo practitioners, and universally, they would ask me two words. They would say, why me? Why would anybody want to hack into my system? And all you have to do, I mean, I think it's pretty simple when you look at the different areas of law. I mean, obviously, MedMal and PI, you have so much protected health information on your systems. Depending on how long you've been in practice, I mean, you could have an incredibly large amount of health records. Think about that. That's worth so much money on the dark web, and that's a huge target. And, you know, I think some people don't think, well, they wouldn't target me. And I personally have seen bad guys will buy domains that are very similar in name to what your domain name is, and send phishing emails hoping to get someone to, you know, to open up the keys to the kingdom, as it were. So there's just so much information, like you said, intellectual property, tax returns, anything with personally identifiable information certainly can be monetized.
And it's absolutely what Brian's saying is correct, but it's much more than the dark web. I mean, there are things called ghost protocols, which some of you are probably familiar with. They get in 8-9 months prior to infection, and these bad guys are watching your data flow. I mean, you know, if you're in trial, do you want your adversary to see what's going on and what your strategies are? They don't care about privileged information. To them, it's data they need. It's intelligence. It's information they want to use to process and further their aims. I mean, to me, it's at a minimum, it's irresponsible law firm. It's almost criminal that they don't protect themselves against that. Now, there are techniques to do it, but it just seems to me that should not be happening. And there are ways to protect it, and you guys need to, I think you need to understand that personally.
So let's say that I'm the hypothetical or not person who's now sufficiently terrified. And this is the first I'm hearing that I need to get into gear to do these things. Where do I start? What do I look for? What do I begin with?
I wonder if this is a good time to go into the presentations, because I think, a discussion of how you do the profiling might be helpful, at least just to further the conversation. So would you want me to run into that, or?
I think that would be great.
Okay.
Sorry, guys, my internet connection kind of went out there for a second, so I missed that last bit.
Can you guys see that? Can you see it? Yeah. All right. Okay. All right. So let's talk about a profile, just so we're all calibrated to the same frequency. What I'm talking about in a profile is, if you think of this as your law firm or your organization, to the right side is the thread. Who is interested in you? All right. It's unlikely that the Putin and the FSB and intelligence agencies are very concerned about a private injury law firm. But it is likely that your adversary might want to know what you're doing, particularly if it would help him in a trial. So what do you do to protect yourself against that kind of threat? Then you've got to think about your people, your data, and your technology. Those are the three areas that define how robust your security profile is. So when you think about those issues, everything that you do or everything that you will do will be a trade-off. And that trade-off is convenience versus risk, efficiency versus risk, and of course, cost versus risk. It's what can you tolerate? And as Brian eloquently said, he made 2 points that I thought really hit home, and I remember them explicitly. It's a holistic approach to security. That could not be truer. There is not one thing, there's not one magic bullet that's going to solve your security problem. You got to look at this thing in toto. And what's most important is how that security flows in your operations. You can spend a lot of money on security, but if it bogs down and you can't operate, it's not of any value to you either. So you got to make sure that whatever you're choosing to work with, it flows well within your operation. So the question is, how do you get there? And it's a timeline. And you start with data collection. Based upon the data collection, you go to an analysis and trade, you make recommendations, and then you implement what you find. Now, when you do collection and you look at the various parts of your firm or your organization, what do you need to see? What should you be looking for? And first and foremost, it's your personnel, because 80 to 90% of your problems are going to come from your people. Like opening a fishing expedition, or worse, is you have somebody inside that's compromising you, or you have an issue with credentials. What first and foremost firms that I think on this call need to have are processes and procedures. A firm of 5 lawyers should have 15 or at least 20 procedures in place. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But those are the kinds of things that you need to make sure that you increase your security profile. You want to understand who's doing the work. Do you have a bad guy working for you? Is he inside? How do you track that? How do you monitor that? Those are things you need to be concerned about. Now, in data, as you move over to data information, people don't realize, but your data is in many, many forms. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But where is your data now? Where is it residing? How are you treating it? And then lastly is your technology. What are you using? Clouds? Are you using your own distributed network? Do you have network addressable servers? What are you using? What are you doing? And you got to think about how you provide security for that. So these are the things you look at in terms of improving your data profile. Now, the trade-offs that you make are what you can actually live with. Now, I think if I move this over, yeah. And if, I don't know if there's any quantitative guys in there, but it's probably intuitively obvious on the bottom right of your screen that as you increase security, your inconvenience is going to go up. And that is truly exponential. But the question is, what do you need? You know, what do you want to do to provide security for your organization? That's what you got to think about. Now, when you talk about personnel, in its most simplest form, you need to educate your personnel. You need to make them understand what the problems are. And I think your insurance guys will tell you, I think most insurances today require training. You have to have some form of training or they're not going to give you an insurance policy. So that's key. On the data information side, how is data being moved? Where is the data? What's available? Let me make a point about email as an example. I don't know if most of you realize when you send an email, that makes 14 stops before it gets to the recipient. That's 14 locations that people can be looking at your email. If it's sensitive stuff, I'm pretty sure you don't want to see that. So you might want to think about encrypting your emails or using some portal technology. Those are your head, in my opinion. So once you've done the collection and you've done the analysis, then you can make recommendations. You can do things that make sense. And I've kind of given you a hint of that. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the personnel because the personnel issues, again, are big issues in a law firm. Some law firms use junior lawyers to do their IT or interface with IT. That may work, it may not work for you. I suspect it depends upon your level of threat. And you should be very careful about using inside guys to do IT. A managed service company like Brian's is crucial, I think, to at least having yourself organized in a situation where you can improve your security profile. If you don't have managed services, you need to have a professional that's involved in your organization, not a lawyer that understands computers. That would be our recommendation to you. I would look at that pretty hard. Even in the smaller firms, you might want to look at some way of improving the way your data flows. Data itself, you need to start thinking about data. There's data at rest. That's the data in your hard drive or data on your cloud. There's data in motion. There's data that goes from the hard drive, goes to an email, it goes to a fob, it goes somewhere that you're going to use it. And then there's data being processed, it's Word or PDF, Word or an Excel spreadsheet. That's all exposed data. That stuff's getting out. It's a portal for damages to occur into your system. And then lastly, you got to look at your technology. Do you guys use your own hard drives? Have you thought about using cloud services? Most likely you're probably using the cloud. You're probably using 365, something along those lines. Well, that data, when it gets from you to there, is exposed. It's available. How are you going to protect that? What have you thought about doing? Have you looked at the various sources that are available to do that? All those things need to be looked at in terms of what their recommendations are. From the standpoint of implementation, you need to figure out what is important to you. So, and I'll read this at the risk of being violating rules of presentations. There are so many effective implementation procedures and processes supporting cybersecurity, it can be difficult to identify optimized techniques. So if you get nothing out of this talk, try and remember this statement. An organization needs to identify its requirements, perform analysis, make the trade-offs, and implement the procedures and technology required before you get hacked and before you're a victim. You need to do that. You need to do it soon. With great deal of certainty, you're going to be made to do this over the next few years. The sooner you do it, the sooner you're going to be the guy that outruns that bear. And I want to make sure you guys understand that, because that is going to, in our opinion, that is the best way to provide security to your firm currently. So with that, I think we can continue the conversation. If you have any questions, I'm happy to address them.
Bruce, I wanted to bring something up that you just mentioned about pen testing. And for everyone that doesn't know that, it's penetration testing, both internal and external. We ourselves, as managed service providers, we have a third-party company that that audits us, because we don't want to be responsible for auditing ourselves. We want a third party to come in and make sure that we're following the best practices. And we use this third party company for our clients as well. Do you think that that is a good starting place for some folks to get an idea of where they are in their security journey, so to speak?
I would say pen testing is obviously a very, very important tool in your arsenal to make yourself, to increase your security profile. The issue is that pen testing is nowhere near enough, all right? Because pen testing doesn't address the personnel side, and it certainly doesn't address the technology side, in our opinion. And and in many cases, the data penetration issues may not be addressed because particularly if you're a managed service, it certainly makes your managed service work well, but the data at rest that's at the law firm itself still could be vulnerable. There's still issues. So law firms need to think about that and think about perhaps how their profile, working with your managed service provider, how their profile is addressed, talk to them about the data, talk to them about your personnel, and feel comfortable that you're addressing it properly. It would be the best. Again, maybe the best way to answer your question was pen testing is important, but it's far from the total solution. It is not a magic bullet.
So from the user side, I know there's a lot of things that we can do to educate users. One thing that we do is phishing simulations. And it's, if anyone's not familiar with it, it's where we send out simulated phishing messages to everyone in your organization. And we get a report back that says who clicked on it, who filled out the form. And that's not to call anybody out. It's not to bring anybody out to the woodshed. It's to educate, it's to find out who needs more education about how to spot a phishing email, what to do. I tell everybody, the first thing you should do is slow down. Before you click on anything, before you act on anything, slow down. And if something seems off to you or suspicious, ask your IT department, ask your help desk, ask your service provider. So, I think security awareness training is really important.
So there's no question security awareness is important. And what is not obvious to a casual observer is that awareness training, it needs to be done at different levels. Your executive staff needs to have a different focus than your administrative staff, from your IT staff. And you need to make sure, in our opinion, that each grouping and each subset of your organization has the appropriate training. Who controls your data flow? Do you want your paralegals to see the bonuses that you give to your senior partners? I suspect you probably don't. And are you making sure that there's no way that stuff's not vulnerable? Issues along those lines from a cybersecurity perspective, all focus from the personnel side on training. So you don't need to train the lower level staff on perhaps on what the senior staff would see.
And Brian, you were mentioning phishing attacks. I think that's something that at least has sort of made its way into general circulation. I know you've, in discussing some of these with you, you told me that scary story about how sometimes bad actors will surveil people based upon their internet presence and trying to attack them that way. Can you, in terms of the things that are statistically likely to be seen, what are those other things that are out there that?
Well, I'll say, and I've seen this time and time again, where people are actually stalked online. Law firms are stalked. We have a cybersecurity accountability group that meets once a month, and one of the people in the group told this story where it was a law firm, and they were out. It wasn't a holiday party. They were out for some gathering, and I forget. I think the restaurant was Morton's. Don't quote me on that, but I think it's not a promotion for Morton's. But anyway, so they posted on Facebook that they were out to this holiday party. They tagged everyone, and they had a great time. The next morning, the office manager goes into the office, checks her email, has an email from the founding partner that says, "Hey, Mary, what a great time we had last night at Morton's. That was awesome. We really got to do that more often. And by the way, I need this wire sent out right away to this ABA, this account number. Can you take care of that for me right away?" And Mary's like, "Well, yeah, of course, this is who it's, I mean, who else would know that we were at Morton's last night?" And when they reverse engineered it, I mean, it was clear they were being surveilled. Their information, their posts were found on Facebook. They were tagged. The person went to the website, found out who was who, found out who the financial person, who the most likely person was to send a wire. She sent a $150,000 wire. Now, this actually happened a couple of years ago, I think. People are much more, attuned to sending wires without checking, but it just is an example of, how you could very well be being targeted and not even know it. So you have to be careful about your social media presence and how much information you're putting out in the world about your company, your law firm.
Yeah, but everybody on this call, in our opinion, should be very careful about focusing on phishing. Phishing is a problem. There's no question about it. It's got a high profile, and it is really directly a function of your employees, because they're the ones that may compromise you. But don't lose sight of the fact that cybersecurity threats focus on denial of service. And denial of service is the end game, because that's how they leverage, and that's how the criminals or the bad guys make money, right? If American Airlines is denied service and they can't write a ticket, and they're gonna find ways to get that up and running, whatever it takes to get done. So that said, when you think about the Metasploit database, there are 10,000 known threats, over 10,000 known threats that are focused on denial of service. It's a lot more than phishing, a lot more. And you need to think about this thing from a holistic perspective. All right, if you don't look at all those functions that we discussed earlier, you're going to be vulnerable in some area. And you really need to pay attention to the big picture from a law firm perspective. At least that's our take.
And just to, go ahead.
Go ahead, Brent.
Paul, please.
No, what I was saying, I mean, there's, certainly a whole list of things that you should be doing. And Bruce is right. Phishing is only one piece of the puzzle. As we said, training to your employees, training, ourselves about what we need to look for. Password management is critical. As Bruce was telling you before, the Colonial Pipeline hack, there were credentials that were found on the dark web. I mean, this is something everyone that's on this call, I mean, again, this is part of the whole security being holistic, should be having their credentials scanned on the dark web. There's some statistic, I think it's like a large number, 80-some% of people use the same password across multiple sites. And the problem with that is, if you happen to use that same password for some critical infrastructure or your login to your system, then that's an entryway. Taking a look at privileges, what happens a lot of times is I see when I come in, if I take over for another IT company, that a lot of times the founding partner has administrative rights. And, we make it a point that, we call them daily driver accounts. Any account that you're logging in with on a daily basis to do your daily work should not have administrative rights whatsoever. And I'll bring up one thing, and I just see this all the time, and it's a huge vector, is remote desktop. Now, since COVID has happened, I'm sure everybody on this call is familiar with RDP, remote desktop. I had an incident, not to tell too many stories here, I'll be brief, but there was a client in New York City. She was an associate here. She became a partner in New York. They called me a week and a half into the incident, and it was there was no more forensic evidence left, because it was a week and a half into it. And Bruce, maybe you can get into this a little bit later when we talk about cyber insurance. There's a certain point during a ransomware attack where you should stop, so you preserve your forensic evidence. I mean, that's in the containment phase very early on. cyber insurance companies will tell you, stop what you're doing because we need to preserve this information. We found out that remote desktop was open to the internet. Like they had multiple computers that were wide open to the internet. So, being secured with a VPN, having dual factor authentication, there's a whole laundry list of things that you can do to protect yourself.
So these are great examples of issues that a firm should institute. Now, go up in elevation 10,000 feet and think about that from the security profile. What we're talking about are policies. Does your law firm have policies? Do you have a password policy? Do you have a credential policy? Do you let your employees use their personal equipment to look at data? When you think about it from a standpoint of management, those policies need to be in place. Again, a firm, a 5, 10, 15 member law firm should have at least 25 or 30 policies in place written by management that you strictly adhere to. That's how you improve your security profile. And that's how you address these kinds of problems.
I think the next thing that I'm curious to learn about is what insurance options are available to help in mitigating against some of these risks that are out there. For that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob Reynolds.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon again, everyone, and thanks for having us here today. Let me also start by thanking Brent and Mitch for the invitation. It's an honor to be with you all. I think it's a great discussion, and I think that the insight that Bruce and Brian are offering is just tremendous, and it's needed. I'm joined today by my colleague here at Morrison Reynolds, Billy Fay. Many of you may have known Billy's dad, Judge Peter Fay of the U.S. Court of Appeals here in the 11th Circuit. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, go through our slide deck, but at the end, I'll give you Billy's information. You'll all have it. I think Mitch is going to distribute this on the other side of today's talk, and we'd be glad to help you in any way that you might need. And I'll share some examples of reasons and ways we might be able to help y'all. So, let's kind of start with defining the situation here. You are definitely a target for sure. This data that you're looking at, this chart, is from a company called Coverware. And what it tells us is that about 20.4% of all claims in the cyber realm are targeted to professional service firms, which of course is what your businesses are. That's also the biggest piece of the pie. So as Bruce was saying earlier, you are definitely, indisputably a target. And I've also included a quote here, and I've included a few quotes because I want to give you some insight as to how folks in the insurance industry perceive the risks that you face. And I thought that that might be helpful. So, here's one from the Cyber Insurance Coalition founder who says that the criminal actors definitely target law firms. And if an attacker can gain access or social engineer, and Brian was talking about a social engineering example a moment ago about the Facebook and the party example and the $100,000 plus that got transferred and stolen, they can walk away with really significant money is the point. So you're definitely a target, and it's a good thing that you are here to talk about these things. And speaking about talking about it, the cybersecurity firm Emisoft concludes that last year alone, there were over 100 federal, state, and municipal agencies, upwards of 500 healthcare centers, and nearly 1,700 educational institutions, plus untold private businesses that suffered extortion claims. And of course, extortion claims are what we call today ransomware. The accurate numbers are a bit elusive because many victims, and I'll use the word again, victims shun reporting of these instances because they're afraid of the reputational damage that they may suffer to their businesses or that their customers might suffer. But look at some of the numbers that are here. The estimated cost of a global cyber ransomware event is estimated as upwards of $200 billion. So I'll go back and I'll refer to hurricanes because we hear a lot about those things in our community. Andrew in '92 was about $26 billion. Katrina in '05, the biggest of all time, was about $42 billion. I believe that the threat from a cyber event in our connected digital world, and these numbers prove that, this particular number is from Lloyd's of London, are exponentially higher. And so while we spend a lot of time talking about, as we should, the other risks we face in our lives and in our business practices, we need to really focus on this risk because it's not going away. It's only going to grow. A few other numbers that jump out at me that I wanted to share with you. 86% of all losses are uninsured. A fraction of businesses carry cyber insurance. And this is not a call to carry coverage. We'll talk about coverage and really the ways to manage risk in a couple of minutes. But I thought you'd find that to be compelling. The property casualty industry where cyber coverage falls is about a $620 or $25 billion business, out of which less than 1%, around half of 1% of premiums are dedicated to cyber insurance. So you can see that most businesses don't insure these losses. And I believe it's because most business owners are of an age, middle age or older, where they're not really tapped into the risks here that they face, and they might not understand the coverage and what's available, as well as the services, which I think might be the number one reason to carry coverage that the insurance companies either offer and or demand from the standpoint of training and protective services and whatnot. This middle number here, $310,000. That's the average ransomware payment over the last year or so. So says the Palo Alto Network in their research. So we talk about the Colonial Pipeline loss. That's $5 million. It's a big number, got a lot of attention, a lot of long lines to get gas, all the things that we know about here. But this number, I think, is more compelling to me because it tells me that the average is hitting a lot of small to medium-sized firms. To get a 310 average, yeah, you've got some big numbers, but you've got a lot of smaller numbers, six-figure numbers. So I thought that that was important to share. And speaking of ransomware, we find here from the Coalition of Cyber Businesses, this is a collective of very large global insurance companies. Their research says from claims, this is real live claims data. Check this out, that from 19 through the first quarter of 2020, last year, that cyber ransomware claims increased 100%. And from the first to the second quarter of last year, they increased again by another 67%. And Bruce and Brian know indisputably that these claims have exploded exponentially. Pretty much everybody knows this, including the federal government. And earlier we were talking about email attacks. I thought these last couple of numbers were interesting. 67%. That is the increase in email attacks that the industry has seen through the pandemic. 14.5 billion spam emails a day. And on average, the industry figures that each of your employees are getting almost 5 of those. Those are 5 possibilities that they could make a mistake. They could be busy or distracted and they could click on the wrong thing. And then that instigates whatever the problem is. Maybe they see it, or often they don't until it becomes far, far worse. So this is where education and training, and not just one time, this has to be consistently done in order to be effective. And then this last number I share with you is this 87%. 87% of all the claims in the industry and 84% of the dollars paid in claims are for ransomware, funds transfer, and business email compromise type claims. So clearly, those are areas that if I were going to focus on trying to address the problem initially with my policies and with the other things that can be done with consultants like Brian and with folks like Bruce, I'd start by focusing in those areas for sure. And here's another thing. And I'm not going to get too deep in this, but I thought it was interesting to share with you. Just in the last year, ransomware crooks, the bad guys, have expanded into what the industry is calling data theft blackmail. So before they trigger encryption, they quietly exfiltrate your sensitive files. That ghosting that Bruce was talking about and through other methods, and then they threaten, once they have that information, to expose them publicly unless a ransom is paid. And victims, even if they're diligently backing up their networks as a hedge against these types of things having to happen, you kind of have to now think twice about how do you approach this and refusing to pay. And here's the point. At the end of 2019, there was one ransomware group, I'm talking about the bad guys, that had an extortion site online, publicly available. And now, today, there are at least 24, and someone like Bruce probably tell me it's an even bigger number. And I want to show you a little bit about what that looks like. Over here on this right-hand slide are 2 examples of these publicly available sites where the bad guys take the info that they steal, and if you don't give them what they want, they're going to publish it. So that's kind of a new and growing thing. On the left is example of an email, or rather a newsletter, excuse me, that my firm publishes and that Mitch and Brent, I think, will distribute on the other side, that gives you some risk management type advice that you might find useful. But this might be something that, when I finish this talk, we might want to talk a little bit about and hear from Bruce and Brian about. Now, let's talk about the coverage for just a moment, because as I was preparing for today's discussion, one of the things that was said by some of the folks that put it together was, we don't think that cyber insurance is particularly well understood. And while we don't have a lot of time to cover all the nuances, what I want you to see is here is how a common insurance company, this is the Travelers, I believe, and that's not an advertisement for the Travelers, but they're one of many companies that writes cyber liability. So here's their insuring agreement. And as you look at this, you can see some of the things that they hit on: network security failure and protected information, which was talked about earlier, privacy and cyber laws being broken and the fines that go along with them, interruption, as in business interruption of service when you're down and you're not able to perform. So you can see the different insuring agreements, and all of you are well qualified, of course, to read an insurance contract. But if you want a copy of one or some samples, just let us know. We'd be glad to get them for you. And then I also built this table for you. And on the left-hand side, and again, I think the fellows are going to distribute this on the other side of today's session, but you can see the various types of coverages that are built into and or available in a cyber policy today. So all the things you hear us talking about are generally insurable. Not that insurance is the end all. It's not. I'm not suggesting that. But I want you to know of the types of things these contracts can insure. The other thing I want you to know, which is probably the most important thing, is the footnote down at the bottom. Cyber insurance is not standardized. The dawn of this coverage was around the mid-'80s, when the internet started to percolate up into existence, and e-commerce and so forth. but none of the policies are standardized. So you will see differences from company to company. And if and when you ever seek coverage, in my opinion, it's important to seek coverage from the marketplace and then to compare, and your agent can do that for you, the top choices. And you'll see some nuances in the coverage from company to company. And that's how you sift down and figure out, what you want and how much coverage and what limits are provided for these different things. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the types of things that these policies can cover, is the point. And with that said, again, in the slide deck, you're going to find some case studies, if you will, and the ones I've included for you relate to professional service firms, obviously including law firms. So here's corporate espionage as one example where there was a merger to take place and the data was stolen, and that led the merger to fall apart, and then lots of other things to happen as far as the cost to figure out what happened through a forensic audit, and the reputational damage and other things that followed. And here's another one that's included about computer hacking. A lot of people use that word hacking, but the insurance companies do not use it as often. And there are certain claims. In fact, Brian talked about one of my favorite earlier of the last 3 or so years, social engineering. That was the Facebook example that he gave about the party. The industry doesn't see that as a hack. They don't see that as a cyber claim. And that's one of the areas that when you're buying this coverage, you need to be very judicious about to find out whether the insurance company provides coverage, and if so, the limit. Because often if it's included as a sub-limit. So this here had to do with an accounting firm whose data was hacked, and we can all just imagine what that meant. Here is a partner in a law firm who had access to her data through her smartphone, which was left in the car. When the car was broken into, the bad guys all of a sudden had access to 15,000 clients and their personal data, their confidential data. That's a bad day for sure. So this is another example of the types of things that these policies cover. We talked earlier, Bruce talked about the cloud. And I think generally speaking, there's a whole lot more protection available in the cloud and through the IT professionals that you would employ to handle your data there. But there still can be breaches depending upon the passwords and the access that is granted, like the fellows were talking about. And that's what this is about. This relates to a design firm, and the situation became so bad that various state attorney generals became involved in this particular claim. But again, it's the type of thing that you can purchase coverage for. And then this is a real estate firm that had an internal breach where a temporary person, as it says here, tried to steal data on the last day of their employment through a USB. And so this goes back to your procedures and your processes, all of which have to be extremely robust, in my opinion now, because so much of our lives and our professional lives particularly is online and it's stored on a computer. And that doesn't mean it's safe. Just because it's out of sight does not mean it's out of sight, out of mind rather, for someone with evil intentions towards it. So that's what this is about. Now, speaking of ransomware, this has been a big question that's been percolating in the last year, really. Do you pay these claims or not? Do you pay them? Do you pay them or not? And then the federal government steps in and they voice their opinion, which has just thoroughly complicated what a business and the authorities should do. I mean, it became much more worrisome when this business model, if you will, shifted to data extortion. And of course, the government has been paying attention to that. And then in October of last year, the US Treasury Office, the Foreign Asset Control Office specifically, kind of added what I would call an extra layer of complexity to these types of events, because officials were then warning that, this may not be permissible to pay ransom to, someone who is extorting money from you. So as you can imagine, the insurance industry has spent a significant amount of time trying to understand the full scope of the guidance that was issued. The FBI's position has been to publicly discourage ransom. However, I would say in practice, what we've seen so far, I haven't seen a case otherwise. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but I haven't seen it so far, where they have provided businesses plenty of leeway and even understanding, given the rise of ransomware, extortion threats and claims in the last year or two. And again, I'll go back to the Colonial Pipeline. I think that is a very good example, because in that case, Colonial paid out almost $5 million. And as many of you know, the FBI has since recovered about half of that money. So they're working there. They haven't gotten in trouble with the government, even though this guidance is out there. And then I included, again, another insurance company, and I'm trying to pick many so you get a sense of what the industry has to say. Here is one that writes cyber insurance, of course. The FBI has gone out of their way to treat ransomware victims like victims and not punishing entities that have paid ransoms. And I think a lot of that begins by engaging the authorities. And if one were to carry insurance, their insurance company, because both of those entities tend to have the availability of professional negotiators who understand these bad guys. And this is a different playing field than what you folks are used to in terms of who's playing the game and who your opponent is. And so what we see is that through negotiation, the initial demand can very frequently be brought down, often significantly, still to big money. Don't get me wrong, but it's important to engage the experts that know how to handle these negotiations, even though I realize all of you are expert negotiators in your own right. This is a different game that you're playing, and I dare say it's probably not one you've played before. So it's good to have experts involved. And so before I close, let me give you a couple of comments. First, about the insurance marketplace. So there is a robust cyber insurance marketplace. It's a global marketplace. A lot of the insurance companies that you know by name and some that you wouldn't know by name have been active in it, increasingly so over the last 20 or so years. Now that market, in the advent of the increase in claims that we've seen, the numbers I showed you earlier in the presentation, the market has tightened. And that tightening is kind of consistent with the overall commercial insurance market of the last couple of years, but much of this is predicated on the increase in claims. So it's a tighter market. What does that mean? It means that the insurers are more scrutinizing, to Bruce and his comment earlier, what your procedures are. What processes do you have in place? They're not going to any longer willy-nilly write your coverage and not give thought to those things. And the reason in particular is because the ransomware claims have become so prevalent and so large. And as I say here again, it's the #1 cyber type claim today, right now, at this time. And so what's happening is some insurers are tightening their coverage, and all of them, I would say, are tightening their underwriting, and they're asking a lot more questions. That's not to say you cannot navigate it. I actually think that process is, to use the word earlier that Brian used, is holistically beneficial to you, because it's going to force you to consider the types of management you need to have in place, the steps you need to have in place, the protocols you need to have in place in order to protect yourself. And while the insurance companies will be happy to write your coverage, they expect you to protect yourself to some extent. And I think that is very reasonable. The other thing I would say is, generally in the market, we are seeing the premiums increase. This is not, for most firms, a overtly expensive coverage, but the premiums are higher this year than they were last year, and last year were higher than they were the year prior. And again, I think that's symptomatic for two reasons. The general commercial marketplace is cyclical, and it's going through a cycle where prices are a bit elevated. That will typically level off and then go in the other direction. within a couple of years. But also this is a reaction to the claims and to the reality of what these numbers are. These are, really significant numbers compared to what they have been historically. So, that's a little picture of the market. And there's a little flyer that we've given to Mitch and to Brent to distribute. You see a screenshot of it here. And then I think I'd like to end, if you don't mind, just talking for a couple of minutes about risk management. So risk management is, to me, the key. And it's age old, and it's used across all industries for all sorts of risks, some of which you can retain. Maybe you retain a risk through a deductible, some of which you avoid through procedures and processes and common sense, some of which you transfer. Maybe you transfer it to a cybersecurity firm, to a consulting firm that's expert in helping you with certain things, or maybe you transfer it to an insurance company, or you do a combination of those things. And then overall, one of the key tenets of risk management is to mitigate or reduce your risk. And I think you do that through training, through consistent and constant training. According to Juniper Research, check this out. I think it's alarming, but it's also an alarming opportunity. Small businesses only pay and spend about $500 a year or less on cybersecurity products. This is across all small businesses in this country. So guess what? That makes them a super attractive target. Guess what? The bad guys know that too. They know that a lot of times somebody doesn't ever change the passwords that come into the hardware that you buy once it's installed. They know what those passwords are. They can exploit that easily. They've been doing that for years. Juniper also tells us that businesses are going to increase this year their budgets by about 50%, and next year probably more like 60 to 70%. And obviously that's because the threat has been growing. Ernst & Young predicts that smaller organizations will probably increase as much as 75% their budget next year. So a lot of us are seeing, like today's talk, attention paid to these areas. And here on this slide are a couple of things that you heard the fellows talking about earlier, and you've heard me talk about. You have to have consistent, continuous training of your people. In my industry, continuing education is a significant part of our lives, and it has been for decades. So that's certainly the case in your industry, but now that education needs to include cybersecurity and how to avoid being a victim. And the good news is, as Bruce and Brian will tell you, there's tons of ways to do that and lots of resources to do that. And I will tell you that a lot of the insurance companies will facilitate those resources for you and to you. So for those of you who carry cyber insurance right now, and your peace of mind began and ended with buying coverage, you check that box off, I would encourage you. In fact, I would challenge you to determine what services your insurance company offers in the realm of training. Who do they partner with? Because the better ones have those solutions and they want you to use them, and that's why they make them available. And it's part of your premium in many cases. So if you're not using them, you're not getting the full value out of your expenditure as far as your premium is concerned. Other things here related to macros, or one of my absolute favorites that I think Brian mentioned, remote desktop protocol. I mean, that's like 60% or so the industry has found of all ransomware begins through that element. And so there are ways to address that for most businesses. And you can see, some of the others that are here. Obviously, you can buy coverage as well. But that's just, in my opinion, the tip of the iceberg. So I want to thank you all for letting me participate with both, especially with Bruce and with Brian. Our contact information is here. If you have any questions, if you want sample information, as I said before, contact us. We'd be glad to help you in any way possible. So Brent, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for having us here.
Thank you, Bob.
Brent, before we go any further on the discussion in terms of the insurance, I think Bob did a great job of explaining the products that are available. I wanted to go and just briefly state to the audience that from a cybersecurity professional's perspective, there's a lot of discussion about insurance, about the policy of offering insurance, whether you should pay ransomware, whether you should do these things that Bob's talking about. But from a standpoint of the security profile and how you're going to maintain security in your law firm, the decision makers need to understand that insurance is a tool. Cybersecurity experts will come in and they will tell you that they need to detect and they need to mitigate and they need to remediate problems. And insurance falls in the minds of cybersecurity professionals as a mitigation technique. In other words, as Brian said earlier, anybody that guarantees you're not going to get hit or that you're going to be safe is not telling you the truth. And he's correct. That would not be true. So you need to find ways to mitigate those damages. One technique is insurance, and it's helpful, and it's a good thing to have in many, many cases. The issue is, what are you going to do about having this not happen, right? And that's the thing that you should take away from this session. What can you do to make sure you don't get hit? Insurance is one of the mitigation techniques. What are you doing to detect the problem, and what are you doing to remediate the problem? Those are the things that this group really should be thinking about. And I just want to make sure that point was put out there.
Appreciate it. And I understand we were obviously discussing the first line of defense is to make sure you're not a victim. I think we have all heard anecdotal evidence of people, even in our legal community, who actually have been victims of this. And it was something that Bob had referred to. And I'll ask Brian, for the person that wakes up and is subject to a denial of service attack, what do you do then?
Well, first thing you want to do is have a plan in place. Obviously, we talked about that before. You need to have an incident response plan. You don't want to wake up and find your data encrypted and not know what to do. I'll go back to something, Bob said, about backup. And I know we're running short on time here, but, I'll be quick. Backup is just, I cannot stress it enough. There's many different things in backup. There's an RPO, I don't want to get into the acronyms, but there's a recovery time objective, which means how much time can you be down? It can take days or up to a week after a cyber event to get your backup restored. So there's technologies out there called business continuity and disaster recovery. There's all kinds of things, all kinds of tools, and we'll have links, on your site. We're going to put some links to some different resources of the different tools that you can use to help protect yourself. But I can't stress that backup is clearly a huge, important part. But you need to have your IT professional on board, or somebody that is, your cybersecurity professional. That would be my first call. Cyber, I was shocked that 86% of businesses don't have cyber insurance. That was a shocking number for me. I would just say absolutely get it, because that would be one of the first calls that I would make. After you have gotten to the containment phase of your response, I think that call, the next call is going to be to your cyber insurance company, because they're going to have very specific things they're going to ask you to do. And if you're going to be covered, you need to make sure that you're following their recommendations.
Brian, could I ask you a question related to the backup, just your judgment and opinion?
Sure.
And it's predicated on the basis that a lot of times we do see folks keeping their backups, no matter how often they make them. And let's face it, they need to be made frequently and consistently, but they'll keep them on the same server as their active live data. And my sense is that makes them, extraordinarily vulnerable. I'm not even sure it doesn't defeat the purpose. What is your opinion about where one's safeguard, their backup, should be stored?
So I have seen this all too often where you walk in and someone has a USB drive hooked up to their server and said, yeah, that's my backup. You know, we're backing up to the USB drive.
Exactly.
Well, guess what? If your server gets hit with ransomware, that USB drive is getting hit also. And then I'll get, well, we rotate them. Well, are you sure you rotate them? And we put them in a fire safe. You know, I see this too many times that, I mean, this is a bad solution. There's a 3-2-1 rule, meaning you need to have 3 copies of your data on 2 different media, with one of them being offsite. So, you know, you have to make sure that those backups are taking place. That's another thing. I love to make sure that a principal or someone in the company is getting reports daily that not only are they being backed up, but proof that we can restore their information. The BCDR was talking about, there's many vendors that offer it, business continuity, disaster recovery. They can take backups as short as every 5 minutes. And if you're a victim of ransomware or a hardware failure, you can fail over to that device and keep working. So that's, you know, a huge thing that I try to impress on my clients.
Thank you.
Right. Well, we are unfortunately just about out of time. I want to go ahead and thank Bruce, Brian, and Bob for all of their extremely valuable information. As everyone was referencing, we're going to have a bunch of resources and information available on our website, www.abotaftl.org. And just to talk briefly about the website, I wanted to hear from Mitch Chester. Mitch?
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can see the page we have just opened up today on the website, abotaftl.org. We have a number of resources here for follow-up from Bruce and Brian, as well as Bob. The video for today's seminar will be posted here by Monday for later on-demand viewing. We have a Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency video, which is very helpful. Actually, 2 from them, which are helpful for your employees and others that are interested in this. We have the links to our speakers today, as well as the PowerPoint that Bob Reynolds was showing you a little bit ago. And we also have some of the cyber updates and materials that Bob was referencing in his presentation. So we have a number of those things, and we'll be posting things as we come across them in the future. We've also posed 2 questions at the end for your consideration. Should there be a statewide legal profession reporting database for cyber attacks? And should your office initiate an internal policy for a 2-level approval of questionable emails? So we'll be adding to this. This site is, this page is something which is an ongoing dynamic effort. We are facing, it's a global war on this. The only thing I would add at the end of my comment right now is simply this, and that is, don't throw out your fax machines. Thank you all very much for attending and for all of your attention and all the presenters.
Thank you, Mitch. I want to just once again thank our amazing speakers, Bruce Spector, Brian Butterfield, and Bob Reynolds. Please feel free to contact them, to use them as a resource. Obviously, they're more than knowledgeable on these. We've greatly benefited from their expertise. I want to thank Jeff Abrams at Swamp City Productions, who is helping us with putting together this CLE. He has shared the CLE information in the chat, so you guys can download that to register your credits. And thank you guys all for joining us on your Friday. We greatly appreciate having you. Again, the website, www.abotaftl.org. And we look forward to seeing you at our next presentation.
And I also want to thank Jeff Edelman. Without Jeff, we wouldn't have had you all attend. Thank you, Jeff, for doing everything you do all the time for ABOTA.
All right. Thank you, everyone.